welcome to Varn Blog. And today we begin a rebranding of an old series that I've already started. I have been doing readings and engagement readings, mostly from books, but also from essays for a while. They're somewhere between arguing and explication. We go through passages and I agree, disagree, point out, whatever I need to do. I was calling these part of the Varn Blog Solo series, but it was causing the Varn Blog Solo series to lose identity. Varn Blog Solo is me talking about, generally speaking, very recent specific issues. And I also wanted to separate it from nailing it down, where I do explainers, although I'm not going to go back and rebrand any of the old videos. So I am, however, going to look at reorganizing list on the YouTube for you. And if you're listening to this in audio, this will just be branded from this point forward as radical engagements. And today we are going to be talking about Tyranny of Merit by Michael Sandel. This is my third engagement with this text. The other two were Varn Blog solos called The Myth of Merit, part 1 and 2. So I suggest you check those out first. This is from the chapter, The Rhetoric of Rising. It is page 60 in the Farrar, Straus, and Giroux version of this text by Michael Sandel, the communitarian philosopher. I first noticed the rising of the tide of meritocratic sentiment by listening to my students. Having taught political philosophy at Harvard since 1980, I am sometimes asked how students' opinion has changed over the years. I generally find this question difficult to answer. In classroom debates about the subjects I teach, justice, markets and morals, the ethics of new technologies, students have always voiced a wide range of moral and political views. I have not noticed any decisive trend with one exception. Beginning in the 1990s and continuing to the present, more and more of my students seem drawn to the convention that their success is of their own doing. They're a product of their effort and something they have earned. Among students I teach, the meritocratic faith has intensified. Pause. This is Varn speaking. I find this interesting because that's also when we start seeing colleges begin to re-gentrify. So undoing the trends of inclusion of the GI Bill actually starts in the 90s. So one of the things I would wonder, particularly at somewhere like Harvard. Harvard is an elite school. It deals with elites, although in some ways it is actually always trying to incorporate more poor students and particularly of minority groups into its base. But that's going to leave you with a specific kind of class bias in your sampling. So is Michael Sandel over concluding here? Well, he's talking about a class that views itself as meritocratic. So in some ways, no. But can we extrapolate from that all the way through society? It's an interesting question. Sandel does actually get to it in this book in some ways, but I think we need to think a little bit more deeper about it. Now, back to reading from Sandel. I first assumed that they came of age during the era of Ronald Reagan, and had absorbed the individualistic philosophy of the time. But these were not, for the most part, politically conservative students. Meritocratic institutions reach across the political spectrum. They emerge with special intensity in discussions of affirmative action and college admissions. Whether students are for or against affirmative action policies, most voice the conviction that they worked hard to qualify for admission to Harvard and therefore merited their place. The suggestion that they were admitted due to luck or to other factors beyond their control provokes strong resistance. I see this too, by the way. Even in people who say they're against meritocracy. It's a common thing to say amongst the liberal left, and yet most of them believe it in their own personal cases. Now, I've talked about the psychological reason why that may be the case. It's called survivor's bias, but this is a larger cultural trend. Survivor's bias just applies when you think that because you got to a situation that everyone could do the same thing as you, because statistically speaking, you passed a certain statistical threshold. right? And thus you extrapolate from that it's possible for everybody because you did it, even though you're not really taking account the odds. I deal with this with teachers all the time. They make a lot of my colleagues make really strange assertions about their own life experience when faced with statistics. And I have to explain to very well educated people, some of whom are even educated in math, how statistics works when it comes to themselves. Nonetheless, let's pick this back up. It is not hard to understand the growing meritocratic sentiment among students in selective colleges. Over the past century, admission to elite colleges has become increasingly daunting. As recently as the mid-1970s, Stanford accepted nearly a third of those who applied. In the early 1980s, Harvard and Stanford admitted one applicant in 5. In 2019, they accepted fewer than 1 in 20. As competition for admissions intensified, the adolescent years of children who aspire to the top colleges or whose parents aspire for them have become a battleground of fevered striving. A highly scheduled, pressure-packed, stress-inducing regime of advanced placement courses, private college counselors, SAT tutors, athletic and other extracurricular activities, internship and good deeds in distant lands designed to impress college admission committees, all supervised by anxious hyper-parents seeking the best for the kids. Put a note in that. While SAT scores and whatnot are being downplayed, the focus on good deeds and internships has actually been upplayed, particularly for things like diversity statements. I've talked about how pernicious this is before, but it's something to think about. The removal of test scores doesn't do anything about this. And in fact, there's no evidence it's going to change either the racial or the economic demographic of those entering colleges, and some evidence that the reverse is true by removing test scores. Why? Well, as Freddie DeBoer has written about in an article I'll try to find and link in the show notes with the citation for this book. But I've seen it in other places. Grades are as racially stratified, even though they're subjective, as standardized test scores, and worse, colleges tend to adjust for zip code on top of that. Adjusting because a grade from one school is not equal to a grade from another. It makes perfect sense from their standpoint, but it's going to reinforce certain systemic problems, such as lack of access to good education, being economic and racialized, etc. So is really getting rid of this test that progressive? Well, maybe, because we're over testing kids. I don't have actually a clear answer for you here. It's just something to think about. Many people are thinking about this only in changing one small element of a complex system, and often what they're exacerbating other elements that are even worse. Back into the book. It is difficult to emerge from this gauntlet of stress and striving without believing you have earned, through effort and hard work, whatever success may come your way. Point in that. That's what I was talking about with survivor's bias. On point. This does not make students selfish or ungenerous. Many devote copious amounts of time to public service and other good works, but the experience does make them staunch meritocrats. Like their Puritan forebears, they believe they deserve the success their hard work has earned. The meritocratic sensibility that I noticed amongst college students is not only an American phenomenon. Point in this. I'm going to say I don't have enough experience in China to vouch for what actually goes on in Chinese universities, nor do I speak Mandarin or Cantonese or Toisanese or any of the relevant dialects. All right. I have spent some time in China. I have taught a lot of relatively privileged and well-off Chinese students in foreign schools in the U.S. and South Korea, in the Republic of Korea, in even in Egypt. So I am familiar with a very subset of elite students who speak English and come from very privileged backgrounds from China. As a side note, there's been some pushback on this in Chinese legislature since 2019 and 2020, which I actually think may be good. So it's hard to know that if even my opinions on students from 5, 6, 7 years ago is still accurate. And I want to be totally upfront about that because I don't want to generalize to a culture by my experience of a few people in it. But I'm going to say my experience with relatively privileged Chinese students at international schools, actually, many of whom consider themselves good communists, by the way. So I want that to be known. Actually does reflect what Sandel talks about here. In 2012, I gave a talk at Xiamen University on the southeast coast of China. My subject was the moral limits of markets. Recent headlines had told of a Chinese teenager who sold one of his kidneys to buy an iPhone and an iPad. I asked the students what they thought about this case. In the debate that ensued, many students took the libertarian view. If the teenager freely agreed without pressure or coercion to sell his kidneys, he should have the right to do so. I've heard that from certain well-off Chinese students too. Not about kidneys, but just they were far more libertarian than I would have thought they were, except on some cases on sexuality, on which exposure to, particularly the United States, tended to change their opinion. Back to the text. If a teenager... others disagreed, arguing that it was unfair for the rich to be able to extend their lives by buying kidneys from the poor. Good communists or liberals, either. A student towards the back of the hall offered a reply. Having earned their wealth, rich people are meritorious and so deserve to live longer. I was taken aback by this brazen application of meritocratic thinking. In retrospect, I realized it was morally akin to the prosperity gospel belief that wealth and health were signs of God's favor. Of course, the Chinese student who voiced it probably was not steeped in Puritan or provincial traditions. He and his classmates had come of age during China's turn to the market society. The notion that those who prosper deserve the money that they make runs deep in the moral institutions of the students I have encountered during the visits over the past decades to a number of Chinese universities. Notwithstanding the cultural differences, these Chinese students, like my Harvard students, are winners of a hyper-competitive admissions process that unfurls against a hyper-competitive market society. It is no wonder that they resist the thought that we are indebted for our success and attracted to the idea that we earn and therefore deserve whatever rewards the system bestows upon our efforts and talents. As Xi Jinping was launching China's market reforms in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States were seeking to move their societies towards a greater reliance on markets. The period of market faith set the stage for the rise of meritocratic values and the practices in the decades that follows. To be sure, markets do not necessarily rest on meritocratic assumptions. The most familiar arguments for markets are about utility and freedom. The first argues that markets create incentives that boost GDP and maximize the general welfare. The second argues that markets leave people free to choose what values to place on the goods they exchange. But market triumphalism in the 1980s prompted the articulation of a third meritocratic rationale. They provided that they operate within a fair system of equal opportunity, markets give people what they deserve. As long as everyone has an equal chance to compete, markets reward merit. Now, markets rewarding merit is actually an interesting idea given the chaos of the markets, information asymmetry, etc. It's one that we've become accustomed to, but it's actually interesting how little it is articulated before this current instantiation of capitalism. It's not something you see a whole lot in early capitalist thinking. In some ways, because it reflects aristocratic thinking. I am good because I have. But it's different than the aristocratic thinking because the aristocratic goodness is actually rooted in blood, in birth, in pedigree. Whereas market meritocracy is rooted in monetary success, even if you have prior accumulation, which doesn't make a lot of sense, and yet it's commonly talked about. Now, these are things that even liberals recognize. What's a Marxist or a socialist to do with this? One, I think we ourselves have to be careful of meritocratic logic when we talk about success or failure. Not out of just equality or some abstract notion like that or our liberty, but because merit always has pre-context. And in fact, meritocracy is sort of like pragmatism in that it talks about, you are rewarded because you are good. And we know you're good because you're rewarded. A pragmatic thinker thinks something is true, or something approaches truth because it is useful, and we know it is true because it is useful. Circular logic. Now, that's an unfair to classical pragmatists, and it may be unfair to meritocratic thinkers, but that is primarily how it is articulated. We need to be better than that on figuring out what we're judging and how we're judging it. And I don't think this is just a U.S. phenomenon. I've encountered it all over the world, although there are definitely different rates of it in different countries. And it is also class in how thoroughly it's believed. And to some degree, I do think in the United States, we're seeing a cultural pushback against this. But what that pushback takes is a whole nother question entirely. Is it from the shortage of labor, where credentialing is no longer as useful as a way to mitigate who enters the labor market that's driving this? Is there larger cultural changes, or, as I suspect, it has too many complicated factors that is so over-determined? Too many things seem to determine it for us to say one way or the other. But regardless, I think it's interesting for us to think about. I also suspect, but I don't know, that some of the meritocratic attitudes that were pushed during the aughts in China are probably slightly mitigated against now. But I doubt you'd completely turn it away. And who knows? Maybe it's just that Chinese meritocracy looks different than ours. Maybe there is such a thing as a communist meritocracy in a transitional society. I have no idea. But what we do know is, while market conditions in China often are owned by co-ops or by the state or by private institutions, it is still a heavily marketized society. And attempts to push back on that marketization have been dampened by the Politburo and outright warned against by Xi Jinping. It's hard to know what to make of this idea when people accept that it's not just rooted in American exceptionalism and the Puritan Protestant work ethic that undergirds it, but as a result of institutional changes and the way we mitigate who enters the workforce in capitalism. And given that so much of our workforce is about to age out, I suspect we're going to see a lot of these attitudes change. But will they change for the better? Will they change for something more useful for socialists? It's hard to say. Furthermore, what we have seen is there is a real attempt to dive down upon and really dig into meritocratic justifications for liberal rulership. And in fact, right now, while conservatives will still talk about meritocracy, they do. It's literally in state statutes passed by Republicans in Utah, where I live, that we can't actually, like, school teachers can't actually say things like meritocracy is not real, or that merit is not rewarded. We can't say that. It's actually literally forbidden by law by conservatives. So it's not just liberals. But there is a sense in which a lot of liberal professionals are now pulling for moral justifications for their positions, not solely competency-based ones, as in the past. Just like I've noted, the movement from an appeal away from the neutral administrative state into crisis mitigation, there's also a move to moral claims about politics, saying that they're essentially the same, thus making political leadership and also any associated material gains one of a moral or merit justification. Just a different kind of merit. Not happy about this myself, but I don't know what to do about it. And with that, I hope you found this engagement useful. This concludes our first episode of Radical Engagement, which is really just a rebranding of some of the episodes that I was sometimes including in Nailing It Down and sometimes including in Varn blog solos. Hopefully this branding makes it more clear what we're doing on what episode. I need to thank some $10 patrons. There's been some new ones. I would like to thank Sif, John G, Yakub C, and alas, Pierre Uric. Thank you so much for your contributions. $10 patrons get preferential treatment on patron-only Q&As. They can suggest topics for shows. If they want to help me co-read a book and are willing to provide it to me, I'll co-read a book with them. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with $10. But if you support at any level, $5 and $3 are fine. $3 gives you all audio versions. $5 gets you additional video that I don't release to the public and all audio versions. And second in priority for Q&As, etc. I'm done with the ad part of this. And if you would like it, I would just like you to like and subscribe, hit the bell if you would like to listen to this in audio form. You can't unless you're a patron. Sorry. But I do provide the videos for free to the public. And if you would like to listen to interviews for free, not on this channel, you can find them at Varn blog, at Buzzsprout, or any podcast aggregator that you'd like. And then reviewing me there would also help me out. Thank you. Thank you for your support. It's been a rough couple of months for me, not going to lie. A whole lot of personal stuff happened that I'm not going to go into. I'm finally feeling a little better. You might notice that I have grown a lot of hair since some of the most recent videos. It's because a lot of the videos that I recorded were recorded a while back. Other than interviews, I've been taking a break. But I'm back now at a more reasonable pace. I'm going to try to have you a few of these solo videos a week and at least one, if not two, interview shows. In addition to all the collaborative shows that we do behind the paywall. You will also find White Boy Wednesday here, including the TIR co-branded version of Nailing It Down on nationalism, and maybe Gaming Materialist. Gaming Materialist will be more irregular right now because we're just not as excited about the role-playing world. Not going to lie about that. So if you're wondering where it's been, that's where. It's not completely gone away yet, but it's kind of on a soft hiatus. Shows that are continuing is diving into the wreckage. We're now doing two series, one on positive principles, and we're still completing one on the sovereign debt and currency crises. We will also be, I think I'm going to be resorting the channel's playlist so you can find different episodes more cleanly. But don't quote me on that. I'm not promising to have that done until the summer when I have time and I'm not teaching, which during the summer months. All right. Thank you so much. You make this worth doing, and I hope you have a great day.